Welcome to all of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name's Arthur Zients. I'm president of the Mind and Life Institute, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome each and every one of you to this pre-conference, to what is a much larger gathering that will start this evening. But the pre-conference itself is an event which is close to all of our hearts, namely the transformation and reflective education, not only of ourselves in need of that, but also the children that many of us care for as educators. So welcome to this, the pre-conference entitled A Tale of Two Movements, what transformative and contemplative education can learn from each other. You know, something like this, as you well realize, doesn't happen all on its own. It really happens because a few noble and adventurous souls agree to be on a planning committee, and then they don't realize quite what they're getting themselves in for. But then they work really hard in order to invite you and the speakers that will be speaking to you and the dialogue partners so that this will be an enormous, I'm sure, and wonderful success. And I'd like to just ask them to stand for me if you'd be so kind. So Dan Barbazat, Grace Bullock, Adi Fleischer, Cheryl Petty, Rona Berlinski, and Emiliana. Thank you, and especially to Grace and Rona, who did huge work as the co-chairs of this gathering. I'm just going to make one little picture, one little remark, which we can pick up on throughout the whole, I think, of the course of this pre-conference. You know, if you'd looked back into the 15th century or 16th century, you would have found, in some sense, two different communities. They went by the names of Vita Contemplativa and Vita Activa, the contemplative life and the active life. And in some ways you declared early on in your life which of the two communities you were a part of. Were you part of the monastic tradition, say, in Western Europe or in Asia? Did you live a life of contemplation, prayer, and reflection? Or were you part of the active civic community, perhaps working as a craftsman or in governance or as a soldier? You were part of that active community. And I think what we are learning more and more is that each and every one of us carries both of these strands within our DNA, our kind of spiritual DNA, and that these are braided together. And that braiding creates a strength and a capacity which each alone, taken by itself, really is inadequate to meet the times that we live in. Each one of us is a contemplative. Each one of us is completely and fully active in life. That's what we're called to do and to be. And so when we speak about a tale of two movements, what transformative and contemplative education can learn from each other, we're really bringing into the modern life these two strands in, I think, a new kind of geometry, a new way of being in the world. And you're exemplars of that. And so what we're going to be doing is, in a kind of daring way, bringing those two strands together here on the stage, and these chairs in some sense symbolize that. Yes, one of us may have a bit of an emphasis more on the contemplative, the other a bit more on the active, but we're there to learn and to work together, learn from each other and to work together with each other, recognizing that we carry both of these within ourselves. So I'd like to ask Grace to come on up, who's done so much in helping to organize this, and she'll be properly introducing this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. Good morning. Wow. I just want to echo Arthur's appreciation to the planning committee, Rona, Adi, Daniel, Emiliana, and Cheryl. It's been such an absolute heartfelt pleasure to work with you, and I hope this day reflects the amount of heart that's been put into the planning of this event. So I'm going to tell you a little story about how we got here, and I think it's a humble but remarkable journey. The 6 of us met in Amherst in the middle of winter on a freezing cold day. And we are a fairly intriguing assortment of people. We have a professor of economics and educators and a lone researcher and some really, really remarkable people. And we gathered for a dialogue, and we had absolutely no idea what was going to come of that event. And we realized pretty early on, even though we had the charge of organizing an event, a pre-conference, we realized pretty early on as we began to talk that there was a conversation that really needed to happen. We didn't all sit in the room and smile and nod and show our appreciation. We actually got into some very gritty, powerful, meaningful topics. And it was incredibly illuminating for all of us. And I think what happened in that day was for us what motivated us to create this event and create this opportunity for all of us to engage in some very powerful, substantive, gritty, meaningful dialogue. But our meeting didn't end there. We decided that this needed to be the beginning of seeding, really a field. Seeding a field in which we can all come together and talk about our strengths, our challenges, what motivates us, the love that brings us to this work in a realistic way, in a generative way, in a way that challenges us to embody the spirit, the practice, however you may phrase it. It challenges us to be the change that we want to see in the world. So we're hoping that this day really serves as a unique opportunity for all of us to engage not only in meaningful dialogue, but the workshops that follow this keynote really are intended to create opportunities for you to form alliances. And we're not talking about alliances that are based necessarily on commonalities or similar work, but alliances based on a true and fundamental love for this work, for whatever it is that you're doing. And we're hoping that you will find commonality in the love of your work and the meaning of your work and use that to build alliances. We don't have any illusions that this is going to be easy, necessarily. And in many ways, like Arthur expressed, this is an experiment. So we're not bringing you here and convening this meeting to say, we have all the answers, because we don't. We're not asking you to come up with all the answers because, well, if you do, it would be a remarkable day. But I don't anticipate that that's going to happen. I think for a measure of success of this meeting, it will be generating questions and forming partnerships, not necessarily having all the answers. And so the workshops that you attend today are offered to you in the spirit of inquiry, offered in the spirit of rolling up your sleeves and really trying to figure out what you're doing, why you're here, and creating some alliances with people who you may never have ever interacted with in any other time and place, and just allowing that to happen. So what we're asking for and what we are encouraging is that you come to this meeting and the workshops that you're assigned to with an abundant curiosity. I think a lot of times, particularly as we get older and we begin to kind of sift and sort into our professions and our ideas and the schemas that we have about the world, our curiosity tends to wither a little bit. And what, for me, was so powerful about working with this group of individuals is that our curiosity was rampant. So we would get together in meetings and just, well, what do you think of that? What do you think of that? That is so cool. I never thought of it that way. And what I would love for you to do is, to the best of your ability, drop as many of your ideas about the way the world functions, and I don't mean necessarily your experience, but you know what I'm talking about, the frames, the schemas, the how things should be. And just approach this day with curiosity and see what happens. So we are very, very excited and very, very grateful to have you all here. I think for us as a planning committee, what this shows us is that there is a huge need for this conversation. And it is our hope that this will be the first of many similar conversations. There is a follow-up to this at the Garrison Institute in December. You'll hear more about that. But it is our hope that this will be the landmark of many, many more meaningful dialogues among people in this room and beyond in the future. So we're excited. We're grateful that you're here. And I encourage you to just enjoy the day, enjoy what the day brings, and try to allow it to fill your heart and perhaps challenge your mind. Thank you. We are very privileged to have Patricia St. Onge with us this morning to lead us in a reflection. Patricia is the founder and partner at 7 Generations Consulting and Coaching. She works with individuals, organizations, and communities to increase their capacity for fullness and effectiveness, and has worked to support progressive social justice movements all of her life. Of the Haudenosaunee and Quebecois descent, she is an activist and member of the Indigenous Grandmothers Circle. Her work is deeply rooted in the concept of the 7 generations, where we honor the generations who have come before us, and we are very mindful that our decisions will affect at least 7 generations to come. She is lead author of Embracing Cultural Competency, a roadmap for a nonprofit capacity builders. Please join us, Patricia.
Sego aguego. Patricia Dano Ikokpeshni Ichuwi Yonyats. Good morning, everybody. My name is Patricia, and it's good to see you. When we come to a place like this, it's often very hectic. How many of you have had a hectic time getting here? So I would invite you now to take a minute. We'll take a couple of minutes to put everything aside, place your feet solidly on the ground. Find the space, the place in you that is most connected to Earth, to our Mother. And we're going to just breathe together. There are studies that show that when people breathe together, it changes the vibration in the room. And so we want to build for the keynote and the workshops by breathing together. So I'll ring a little gong here, and when I do, I invite you to just pay attention to your breath. I know this is not new to many of you, and so I don't want to over-explain. So just follow your breath. And if it's helpful, find that rooted place in yourself and feel yourself rooting down, rooting down, rooting down to the center of our Mother. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, Patricia. For those of you who saw this event many months ago, you're probably aware that the initial intention of the planning committee was to have John Powell and Linda Lantieri in dialogue as the opening keynote. And unfortunately, Linda has a personal situation that has made it unavoidable for her to be here. She has asked me to extend her well wishes to everyone, and she regrets that she's not in attendance. But I think the day will be remarkable as well. And I would like to introduce you to John Powell. John, would you like to come up and join me? Good, thank you. I am absolutely pleasured and delighted and honored and thrilled to introduce John Powell. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues including race, structural racialization, and othering. Ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policies and practices that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. Professor Powell has written extensively on a number of issues, including spirituality and social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society, and is the author of the book, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you. After many conversations, but you still got to help me with my iPhone.
I know. I still have to help you with your iPhone. We'll do that afterwards. So John and I have had several conversations talking about how to best be of service to you on this day. And I think that to begin with, it would be really fascinating for us to learn a little bit more of John's story as a man, as a human, as an educator. So if you could tell us a little bit about your beginnings and how that has influenced you today, that would be wonderful.
So it's a delight to be here with all of you, and especially a delight to meet Grace after talking to her on the phone many times, and feel like I already have a new friend. You know, how we got here, how I got here, but how we got here, right? I have a friend, and I asked him recently, so how old are you anyway? He says, oh, about 13 billion years. And I think all of our journeys started a long time ago, and there are different stories. There's not a story, but many stories. And our stories consist of how we think of ourselves, how we think of the 7 generations, how we think of our family. So I'll share some of those stories, but I'm very mindful of the fact that we have multiple stories. We all have multiple stories. In my book, I talk about the multiple selves. And my parents were sharecroppers in the South, from Missouri and Mississippi. I was the first, one of the first children in my family born in the North. I'm 6 of 9. Doesn't mean I'm a Bork. But I'm from what later I found out was considered a large family. I don't know where people thought the family should stop, but I'm glad they got at least to 6. Actually, I'm glad they got to 9. My family is pretty amazing. My mom passed away a few years ago. My father is a Christian minister, and he's now 94 years old, lives outside of Detroit. And we grew up sort of in modest means. In Detroit, my family had a real love of cars. They still do. But more than anything else, I guess I would say my family was one full of love, but also a lot of deep, what I would call surplus suffering. I remember one day my father, being a farmer, an ex-farmer, sharecropper, so you did everything yourself. You never called a plumber, you never called an electrician, you did everything yourself. So he was fixing the furnace, and it blew up, and it burned, singed all the hair on his body. And I was probably 13 years old. I remember driving around Detroit, trying to find a hospital that would accept him, as he was in the back of the car, and I'm sitting there with my brothers in excruciating pain. And it took us 3 or 4 hospitals before we could find one that would accept him. And another sort of curious thing about me is that I've been curious. I joined your conversations years ago, Grace. So my family is very religious and very loving. So I don't remember starting to go to church. I think it was something you sort of born into, and everyone did, and everyone expected that of everyone else. You didn't know anything else. And our church, my father's church, would end service every Sunday by saying, if you have any questions, please stand up and ask. And one Sunday, the minister, it was not my father, asked that question, and I stood up. And there was an audible, you know, and it was only then that I realized no one had ever stood up. And I was 11 years old, living in Detroit, and the minister said, that's okay. What's your question, Brother Powell? And I said, Brother Manuel, what's going to happen to Chinese? And it's like, what? And because at 11 years old, I started reading a lot, and I knew there were a lot of Chinese. I never met one, but I knew most of them were not Christian. And the doctrine in the church was that unless you were baptized in Christ, you went to hell. And after several attempts to answer my question and leaving me feeling unsatisfied, I never went back to that church again. That's when I started leaving the church and started a different kind of inquiry. I'll just tell you a little bit more. Since I'm older, this could take days, right? But I won't. So when I got ready to go to college, which was an ordeal, the school tried to prevent, frankly, black students at the time from going to college. I went to a school that was supposedly integrated with black and white students, but the black students were all geared toward the factory, and the white students were geared toward college. So I had to fight that in high school. When I was ready to go to college, again, I have 5 sisters, and I was accepted to a number of schools, including Harvard, Princeton, and some other schools. And I remember saying to my family that I wasn't going to Harvard because they didn't allow women in. And people started saying, yeah, but they have this other school, this part of Harvard, it's just like Harvard, and that's where women can enroll. And I, you know, and I'm all of 17 years old. And I said, that just doesn't seem right to me. And I remember my mother said, well, boy, you're not going to college to chase girls anyway. She got that wrong. But anyway, I decided to go to Stanford, and my parents said to me, if you don't go to Harvard, we're not going to help you in terms of going to college. And even then, I knew it was a hollow threat because my parents didn't have anything to help in terms of money. So I ended up going to Stanford, but that's how I got there. And so I've always had this sense of looking at the world, being part of the world, and being connected. And just as I've gotten older, I've become more explicit in that. And there were many years where I felt like I was holding a kind of spiritual practice on one hand and social justice practice on the other hand. And as I got older, I realized it was the same practice. And it took me a while to get there, but and it's nice to be here now.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Powerful story. I'm going to keep diving into your stories. I'm going to pause for a second. For the people who are looking for seats, if you walk down several doors, there are seats open at the other end of the room. So please feel free to make yourself comfortable. And I'm sure as John continues to speak, you will be more and more intrigued and have more and more questions. So we've handed each of you a note card, and there is a pen in your canvas bag if you don't have a pen with you. So if you would like to write any questions that you have on a note card, we'll have someone come around at about 9:30, 9:35 and pick up your questions. And so we'll have more of a dialogue with John. So you know that's available. So your roots were in Detroit, and you went to Stanford, and you told me that you ended up back in Detroit as an educator, which I thought was a really fascinating story. Could you share a little bit of that with us, please?
Sure, so it's actually interesting leaving Detroit and going to Stanford. It was like a real cultural shock. It was the first time, I'd heard that the majority of people living in the United States classified themselves as white. But it's like in Detroit, my world was fairly small. It's like I looked all around and said, where are these people? And so they were at Stanford. That's and my freshman roommate, I remember it was the first time really meeting someone his family was a billionaire. That was a long time ago. And so just the experience of being at Stanford and being shocking. And I remember every time I'd come back to Detroit, they'd be like, but then also I became aware of just the difference in terms of structures, opportunity, life trajectory. And I want to go back to Detroit and participate in that life and try to help. So I went back and started teaching. And I taught students who had been kicked out of the regular school. They were called ungraded at the time. They were virtually all black students. And it was actually wonderful. The students lived in the neighborhood that I lived in, or I should say I lived in their neighborhood. After a while, they would actually stop by on the way to school to make sure I was coming. And many of them were clearly curious, conceptually very smart, and I wondered what they were doing there. And they'd either gotten in a fight or something had happened. They had many hard circumstances. Remember, I went to one student's home one day, and in the middle of the winter, and there was literally a hole in the side of his house, and his family had tapered it over with plastic to try to get through a Detroit winter. And the students initially were not that interested in what I call conceptual learning, but they were interested in things like photography. And so I used photography to sort of teach the class, and then I'd bring in albums. Some of you may remember albums. Yes. And we used the albums to sort of teach poetry. And we actually had a very close-knit community. I remember one day a student came up behind me. These were students from 14 to 19. One student came up from behind and grabbed me and held me tight. And he said, so if I was really fighting, what would you do? What would happen now? And I said, I think I'd get my butt kicked. But one day I left the class to do something, I can't remember what, and a couple of students got in a fight, and the school found out, and they were obsessed and incensed that I would leave these, from their perspective, wild kids alone by themselves. So they fired me. And the students were wild, so they took over the school and insisted that I be brought back. So I was brought back. And we finished the semester, and then when the students went away for the summer, they fired me again. And I could see a pattern happening here. So that's when I left K-12 education, and for a while was a social worker, and then eventually went back and got additional degrees, and still have been involved in education There's friend and colleagues here. There's something called the National Equity Project that works with schools. So I work with high schools and elementary schools and colleges around a range of issues around the country. But that was my entry point in terms of teaching. And it was interesting also to engage the administration and the structure of school, not just what happens in the classroom, but you had these overlayers of people who were somewhat removed from the students, who had a lot of ideas about what the kids were like.
Wow. That was one of my favorite stories that John's told me thus far. I'm sure there are many more. We talked a lot about, and I read as much of your book as I could. Not that it's a great book.
It's not a page turner, though.
Well, let's just say that it requires some serious focus, and preparing for this meeting was it was a challenge to have enough time to sit down. But it's a fabulous book, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
We talked a fair bit about this issue of a divided life and the fact that for many, there is a division between their work and their spiritual life, or their work and their contemplative practice. And we had an interesting discussion about that, and one of the things that fascinates me about you is that you have been able to take these very, very rich threads in your life and weave them together in a way that's really powerful and very profound. And so I was wondering if you could speak to us about two different threads. One, as someone who's more involved in the social justice, equity, educational reform, transformative ed side, as a driver for their lives, how do you see the contemplative life and practice influencing them? And then on the flip side, how do you think that people who are more involved in contemplative teaching and learning can be informed by what is going on in the social justice world?
Again, as I suggested earlier, as I've gotten older, I found that I have a friend who's actually writing a book, and she's written several books, but she's writing a book about the bridge between contemplative life and social justice. And so she sent me a manuscript and asked me to give her some comments. And I thought it was really, really a beautiful book, and I gave her some comments. Then at the end I said, you know, for purposes of teaching and the way that we organize our lives, it makes sense to talk about this bridge between the contemplative life and the social justice life. But at a deeper level, they're the same. So there's no bridge. They really are the same. And at least that's my understanding after many years of practicing and also being engaged in what's called social justice. So there are different ways in which we can think about each of those things. So the way I think about them at their root is really addressing difficult issues in life, trying to find the meaning of life, and eventually sort of understanding the deep interconnection of life, the profound, interrelated, non-hierarchical connection of life. And as we sort of lean into our deep sense of interconnectedness, we realize that's the heart of social justice, and that's the heart of spirituality. Not to just think about that, but to really live it and experience it. To sort of be informed by that actually then creates compassion and love, and gives us a different sense of suffering. So again, for many years, I was in these two different communities. I started contemplative practice, or what we might call that, probably in 1968. I spent a year and a half in India, largely sitting. My first major retreat was with someone called Goenka, and had some profound experiences in terms of sitting. But always, and then I would go back to my friends who were involved in progressive politics and who were suspicious. In fact, some of my friends were worried that I would become too removed. And there was a sense that what you needed to actually do the work in terms of social justice was this edge called anger. You need to be mad at somebody. And that's what fueled the work. Now I should say, I'm not one of those people who believe anger is bad. You know, I quote King sometime when he talks about righteous indignation. would suggest there's also non-righteous indignation. But I think when we look at what's happening to each other, to life, to the planet, there is a sense, at least in me, to quote someone like Joanna Macy, of a deep sorrow and if not indignation. So really trying to bring these two things together in a real way, to me, has been that journey, and that's what I try to talk about in the book. Think about something like segregation. So I talk about social justice and spirituality as both about a deep understanding of our profound interconnectedness with each other, with the world, with life. And then think about something like segregation or apartheid. What that actually is an expression of is institutionalizing a separation. Is saying that you and I, whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian, Native American, are fundamentally different. Think about things like anti-miscegenation laws and practice that was rampant in the United States until 1967. It's denying our shared humanity. And I think in terms of denying our shared humanity, we deny our own humanity. That these problems are not just problems to be addressed or solved out there. They're also in us. That the diversity that we actually organize around reflects not just a diversity in the world, but diversity within ourselves. So to me, to try to understand that and share that understanding to the extent that others are interested in it is quite important. And as I sort of think about a lot of the efforts of bringing spirituality or contemplative practice to the social justice movement, from my perspective, too often it's been one-directional, in the sense that people could be better at their social justice work if they learn to be quiet, if they learn to center their body. There's less understanding from my perspective of how our understanding of the contemplative practice would benefit from a deep understanding of social justice, to be really grounded in real experiences of people and lives. And so I think, and certainly King and Gandhi talked about that, but we still sort of think of them as separate. And I think, as Arthur suggested, they both suffer when we try to keep them separate.
Yeah, there were some aspects of your book that when I was reading them that really struck out for me. The idea of, you talk about self and other, and the fact that I think a lot of the solutions in education have been to try to deny the differences and to try to create commonalities when there really aren't any. And I love this paradox in your work, in this work in general, between having this common heart, having this sense of unity around humanness, and yet there really are differences. There is diversity. And I was very struck when I read the piece in your work about the fact that if we don't acknowledge the differences, in some ways we're just perpetuating the problem. Right. So I wonder if you can talk about that a little more.
So there's here, I guess in Boston, I guess I think she's the dean of Harvard Law School, Martha Minow. She wrote a book called "What Difference Does a Difference Make?" And so even the notion of sameness and difference is actually, like a lot of things, when you look at it, very complex. It depends on how you're looking at them. But a lot of times, a lot of differences are actually situational. A lot of them are structural. We have different experiences that, and the experiences, even calling them experiences is in some ways a misnomer, because it's not simply like, I have an experience. It's this, we're constantly being constituted by our interactions, by our, the fact that I'm 6 of 9. I was talking to a friend recently, and she said, "Oh yeah, I can see you have that middle child syndrome." And I can't say I don't, right? But what she was saying is you've been marked by being a middle child. That something about being a middle child makes it different, gives you a different perspective than being an older child, the oldest child, or being the baby. And so in some ways, we don't really know what these differences are or how important they are until we play with them. We can't just smooth over them. The person who's homeless has a different experience than a person who's not. How profound is that is up for grabs. But it's not like, well, as I say, get over it. And these things are complex in so many ways. When we engage these differences, again, it informs not just the other, but it informs us. And sometimes we're uncomfortable with differences, so we want to, pretend like they're not there. We want to pretend like we're all the same. And we're not all the same. We haven't all had the same experience. We don't have all the same life expectancy. We don't have all the same understanding. And to be able to embrace the differences, even as they change, I think is quite important. So one is to not conflate we're all the same. Two is not to think that we're infinitely other. Or that line between sameness and differences is stable. It's constantly shifting. It's a dance. And when we engage with each other and ourselves in profound ways, it necessarily changes. And I'll give you just one example. I have a lot of students at Berkeley who have come from modest backgrounds. And they actually oftentimes go through this intense anxiety because they are watching their sense of self. They're watching their identity shift. So I had a couple of Latino students last year saying, talk about not liking Berkeley, and this is this elitist institution, and they're still down with their cousin and their brother who never graduated from high school, and even though now they're in a PhD program at Berkeley, they're just the same as they were before they left the community. I said, okay, that's fine. So when you write the paper for this class, I want you to do two things. This is the assignment. Write the typical PhD paper that you write for a graduate seminar to me, and then I want you to write a second paper to your cousin or your brother that never left Fresno and didn't graduate from high school. And they found that second paper incredibly difficult to write. And one student in his draft, he's talked about the hegemony of capitalism. And I said, so your cousin talks about hegemony, huh? And so our experiences actually mark us in some ways. And again, watch us change. Or people, as we age, as we watch our body and our mind change. There's a famous singer who has Alzheimer, who his memory is going away, and he's written his last songs or set of songs. And then one of the things he says is that to his wife and family, he says, it's been a wonderful journey, but I won't miss you. And what he's saying is that I won't even remember you, right? So is his situation in life the same as ours right now? So to be willing to sort of grapple with the complexity, not only of our own life, but of others. And so it's not sameness and difference in self that's the problem. It's when we institutionalize them, when we make sort of categorical meanings around them, when we either deny them, keep people stuck, or we valorize them, that also keeps them stuck, instead of playing with them and dancing with them in a much more sophisticated way.
That's powerful. And I think in some ways, hearing you, you're encapsulating so much of what from the contemplative perspective, what the contemplative perspective is. And in a sense, with repeated practice, we learn to hold the unknown in a crucible. In so many ways, regardless of the type of work you do, what we're being called to do is to create this capacity to sit with, I don't know. And as we continue to have these dialogues, and even through our dialogues in the groups, in the discussions we've had in the planning committee, one of the things that's become really apparent for me is that I just don't know. And in some ways, it's incredibly liberating. And what you're talking about in many ways is holding this space for this dialogue, holding the space for not knowing, but understanding that there's a common thread of, I call it heart, but just maintaining that humanity, but also within this entire macrocosm of we just don't know. And that's a really powerful place to sit, because that's when we get to create what it is that we want to envision in education and healthcare and science. I know that you're out there. So yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it's Pandora's box of possibility, but then we don't want to be too Pollyannish and not acknowledge the realities that we're dealing with. They don't go away just because we're exploring the unknown.
So when Grace and I were preparing for this, I talked about that I'd like to ask interviewers questions as well as respond to their questions. And Grace gave me a long list of questions not to ask her. But this wasn't on the list, Grace. So
Oh,
I didn't ask you this question. So I certainly embrace what you just said, but you know, I come from a tradition. My father is a Christian minister, and I've always been struck in terms of the contemplative movement here in the United States, of the racial makeup of the movement. I've also been struck, frankly, in terms of drawing on traditions from the United States, that there hasn't been as much dialogue as I would, and there may be a reason for it, and I want to ask you for that in a minute, in terms of the black tradition, in terms of, and so my father, who's now 94 years old, lives with my sister, who has constant pain and legally blind, but still one of the most grateful, happy people in the world. But he thinks he does know, right? He would, and in fact, you know, we've had many conversations. You can imagine. I literally can remember having him, trying to teach him to meditate, because he's saying, John, I just don't know what you're doing. It's like, okay, Dad, come on upstairs. Let's. And I remember when my mother was alive, and again, my parents trying to make sense of my life, and I'm trying to make sense of theirs. And I remember giving my mom a story about the life of Siddhartha and Buddha, and she read it, and afterwards I said, so what did you think, Mom? And she said, well, great book, but I don't know why Buddha just didn't accept Jesus to be his savior. And I didn't have the heart to tell her there's a 500-year gap. But my point is that even as we sort of reach out, why there has not been more dialogue and real engagement in this country with the black community, with the black tradition from religion and even spirituality, that has been so powerful in the United States in terms of social justice, of addressing things like school segregation and Jim Crow and slavery. And it always strikes me as odd that we, and I consider myself part of the contemplative movement, that we are not deeply engaged with that, or Dr. King's notion of the beloved community, which again, I don't see reflected, at least explicitly, much in the contemplative community. So could you help me understand that?
I forgot to put that question down. You know, in all honesty, I have to preface this by saying that I grew up in Canada. So there are social issues that are just not part of my fabric. I've been in the States for 25 years, and I've witnessed a lot, but I don't feel as though I own, the issues the way people in this room do. So I want to preface that by saying I'm much more privy to the indigenous population and the issues that are going on in Canada. I think that there are some similarities and there's some vast differences. Purely from the perspective of a human and someone who is a psychologist and a scientist who likes to study human behavior and is fascinated by it, I think that particularly now in this culture, we're so incredibly rooted in fear. And I think there's a fear of doing something, there's a fear of having these conversations, and there's a fear of not having these conversations. So even when the planning committee was beginning to, you know, put our heads together, I think that there was a genuine fear of having this dialogue. What are we going to be engaging in? What box are we opening? Will we all be able to sit here and have this conversation in a curious, respectful way? but also be genuine to the realities that we're living in. So we were very adamant about not creating a Pollyannish bubble and saying, you know, isn't this lovely? We're all here. We love contemplative education, and move forward. We really wanted to engage in a meaningful dialogue, but I do think that fundamentally doing so provokes some fear. And I think we're at a point as a country and a world that not doing so is more detrimental. So I don't specifically have the answer to your question. I don't even feel qualified, frankly, because it's a lot bigger than my personal understanding. But I do feel that there is this tension between knowing, I mean, I would venture that everyone in this room is here for this dialogue because we know we have to do something. And yet every single person in this room isn't entirely sure what that something is. And as you and I talked about, putting yourself out there for this conversation implies a certain degree of risk. And I think stepping forward publicly is also fear-provoking. And as we talked about, you know, there are hierarchies and things you can say and not say. And so I think there is a high degree of fear, but I also would venture that the people that are here for this conversation are willing to take it one step further and move beyond that fear to actually listen to what people in the room have to say, whether it be, you know, difficult. We had some difficult conversations in Amherst. I won't kid you. And I think that it required a lot of the ability to sit and listen and not be defensive. But that is a very difficult proposition when someone's pushing your buttons and getting at your identity. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just add one thing, if I might, that you asked earlier about education. So, you know, you think about K-12, and then you think about higher education. And I know we're bringing practice into both of those places, or there's a dialogue around those. And I think in some ways, you know, K-12 is in some ways different than higher ed because K-12 is compulsory in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and I was talking to my daughter yesterday, and she says, I got to go because Alma is you know, too sick to go to school today, except she's not sick at all. You know, it's that anxiety. It's like, I don't want to do this. I'm 5 years old. Why do I have to do this? You know, can I have a headache instead? You know, it's a little different at higher ed. And so I think that, you know, the idea of taking our 4 or 5-year-old and turning them over to an institution and then having that institution shape them in some way and then bringing a contemplative practice into that feels different than what happens at the college level. And the major problem, at least the spearhead of the problem for education in terms of pre-K to 12th grade is organized, frankly, around race and culture. It's larger than that, but that's what it gets organized around. So when people think about the challenge of education, whether it's Oakland or Detroit or Des Moines, it's this race is at the center of it. We may not name it when we talk about from the curriculum, and it's structured in a very interesting way, right? So that 70% of teachers in K-12 are white women, and majority of students now entering to schools are students of color. And when I talk about white women, I don't mean just a phenotype. I mean people having certain experiences, people having a collective identity, and obviously there are a number of important exceptions to that. And when I talk about students of color, again, I'm not talking about phenotype. We're talking about, going back to your earlier question, we are talking about those differences. And so then we try to make up for it with something called cultural competency, which gets to be an add-on. And if we were having this conversation in the 90s, we'd be talking about teaching tolerance, which is sort of a very strange concept, I think. But anyway, so it seems to me when we talk about education and the spearhead of education, especially at K-12, implicit in that is culture and race. You know, I think about what happened to the Native American communities as the larger community decided, we're going to educate your children. And not just in the United States and Australia, so they took the children away from the tribe to educate them. what do you mean educate? We want to teach them to be something other than like their parents. Because their parents are problematic. And so that to me is part of the tension that, and we keep every 2 years, we come up with a new curriculum for kids. So okay, that didn't work, so now we have core curriculum in California now, or No Child Left Behind. And I think, I was thinking they should rename that instead of No Child Gets Ahead. But again, implicit in that, when we adopted No Child Left Behind, which was actually taken from Mary Wright Edelman and then usurped by the president, former president, again, implicit in that discussion was the whole issue of race and culture, but it was implicit. And to your point, Grace, is that I think it would benefit from it being explicit. Let's have the discussion. Let's talk about what makes us uncomfortable. And we know from the mind science, when things make us uncomfortable and we don't talk about it, it doesn't go away. And in fact, it shows up, sometimes sideways. So it's important for us to find space to talk about that. And I think not just a contemplative practice for the students, but for the teachers as well, so that they can sort of sit with their discomfort and their perspective would be very helpful.
Agreed. Thank you. I'm going to take a little pause here. I see that our volunteers have shown up to collect your cards and questions. So if you would please pass your questions to an aisle, we'll have folks come around and get them for you. While that's going on, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. You and I discovered when we were speaking that we both share the love of music, and I was really struck by your analogy about jazz and how jazz reflects life. So I was wondering if you would be willing to share that with everyone here.
I'd be happy to. Let me get a sense. How many of you in the room actually like jazz? All right.
You've got a good audience.
All right,
now.
great. So talking to Grace, and as she said initially, this session had been planned differently, and because of circumstances, we had to change it. And so in talking to Grace about this, there was some angst about, well, how's this going to work? And part of it was like, well, we had it scripted one way, and now it's happening a whole nother way, and it might not work as well. And so Grace and I was having this discussion, and one of the things I suggest is that I'm a student of jazz. And the way I think about jazz structurally is that you prepare, you learn it, you understand the structure, and then you relax. And in that relaxing, you engage with the world, and that's called improvising. But improvising is happening on a platform of deep preparation. So it's not just, I'm just going to do what I want to do. It's that I'm reading from, interacting and reading from the environment, both internally and externally. And so it's that love of jazz that I actually approach life and approach our conversation, that in reality, we don't know what's going to happen. We prepare for things, and then life happens. And we go, oh, damn, that's not what I wanted to happen. Okay, great, no, but now it's happening. Something's happening, what are you going to do? And to me, jazz sort of says you improvise. You engage with life, and you do a dance. And sometimes it's really beautiful, and sometimes it's not so beautiful. So that's how I think about life, and actually, frankly, I think it's actually a good way of thinking about education and a way of preparing. I think about education in the formal sense, what happens when I drop my granddaughter off at school. But education is really lifelong, and it's a process. It's not a thing. It's a process that goes on. And there are people who can help, teachers, parents, wise people, and the same in terms of practice. And again, I think that space to actually prepare and then relax and engage with the world, and to get better and better at that, and better may be the wrong word, but get more skillful at that. I think that's the dance.
Yes, life was what happened when we were busy making plans for this conference. So I see that there are quite a few. Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. I regret that we're not going to have a longer session, but I will do my best to get at as many as I'm able. What do you do to frame an uncomfortable conversation?
Great question. So there was a situation at Austin, Texas, where black students were graduating at a rate of about 20% in 5 years. Latinos graduating at a rate of about 40% in 5 years. And white students graduating at a rate of about 80% in 5 years. And the school was appropriately exercised about this problem, with these just racialized disparities. And it actually introduced a number of programs, remedial programs, to try to correct it. And then one professor who had hated college when he was in college, and I think he may have been Latino himself, he actually called some of these students together. And we had a conversation about how uncomfortable it must be for them to be at UT Austin, how alienating it was, how it created a profound sense of otherness and not belonging. And the university was a little bit upset. It's like because he was taking all of the elephants out of the room and talking about them. He was talking about the things we're not supposed to talk about. He was talking about being uncomfortable. And he wasn't making the students the problem. It's like, this is an alienating place. I mean, literally, I almost went to UT Austin. I think it's a wonderful school and university. And as I'm going there and they're taking me around the campus and they're saying, we just want to point out there are a lot of statues and memorabilia of Confederate soldiers, just so you know, right? So the point is that when we have uncomfortable things, I would say 3 things. One, to acknowledge it in ourselves. And that's what, to me, a sitting practice is. Things come up and it's like, oh, and we stay with it instead of run away from it. But 2, in an interactive way, to actually create space to talk about it. And what happened in the situation in Austin is that after talking about how alienating the place was, within a short period of time, the black students are graduating at almost the same rate as the white students, and the Latino students are graduating at almost the same rate as the white students. And when researchers saw that, they didn't believe it. The question was belonging. And by naming it and creating a space to talk about it, it changed everything. And so when we have these uncomfortable things, that's okay. You're uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable. So what? Let's talk about it. Let's hold it. Don't run away from it. Create space for it. Welcome it into the discourse. And again, it won't always be easy, but we can engage it. And so that's what I would say about framing uncomfortable. But do it in a way that's loving, that's supportive, that's not blaming. So that's the other part of it. I was invited into a community. I'll tell you this quick story and then I'll move on. I was invited to a community where, I won't name the community, it's a very conservative, primarily white community, largely Tea Party, upper middle class, and they invited me there. And my showing up, at least in some instances, made people uncomfortable. You know, like, literally someone said, so what are you doing here? And I said, other than the fact that you invited me. And the reason they invited me, and they invited a number of people, is that this community is also a very Christian community that's a missionary. And they had gone down to Haiti after the earthquake about 15 years ago and adopted a bunch of Haitian children. And they brought them back to this community. And now these cute little kids turned into young black girls, women and men. And the community was struggling. And there was all this pain in the community. And so they had a number of people come through trying to help them figure this out. And I won't tell you the whole story, but so they brought me there. And after listening to them and talking to them for a while, I said, this must be so painful because it's clear that you love your children, and yet you have this deep schism now. And I was in a room of, I don't know, almost like this, and people just start crying. And one of the persons said, it's the first time that someone really recognized our suffering and didn't blame us, didn't start calling us racist. And obviously there's a racial dynamic going on, but there's also suffering. So the other thing in terms of these hard conversations is to have them, but to have them in a way that's not sticking a finger in someone's eye. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm doing my best to read your questions, folks. While people of color have been engaged in contemplative activities for a long time, they've often they're not extensively represented at conferences such as these. What steps can be taken to make conferences and organizations more inclusive and representative of the contemplative traditions of people of color?
Well, that was the question I asked you.
I know, I'm trying to get it back at you. I didn't write it.
So I met with, so one of the clusters of the institute I run is the religious diversity cluster. We have 7 different clusters. So one is economics, gender, disability. Religion is one of them. And so I met with people from the religious diversity cluster. And part of that cluster, they have a theological society at Berkeley. And they came and met with me a couple of days ago. It was very interesting because great people, and I think they're trying to do really wonderful work. And they were asking me how to get essentially non-Christians to come to their space and have a dialogue. And I think they will reach out. But I kept going back to, there's some people who are not non-Christian and are not Christian either, right? I mean, do you get up in the morning, for those of you who are non-Christians, do you think of yourself as non-Christian? So, no, I'm Jewish. No, you're non-Christian. So myself, for example, I'm non-Jewish. So what I'm suggesting is that sometimes even our effort to be inclusive already creates a schism. You know, I'm already defining you as other. And I'm asking you, I'm going to be inclusive. Come hang out at my house. But it's still my house. And when you come, don't be messing with the furniture. And, oh, wow, it's 5 o'clock. It's time for you to go home. So part of the thing about being inclusive and having real dialogues, and Grace, you talked about this in terms of like relaxing. I don't think we can completely get beyond them, but relaxing these schisms. How do I engage with someone? And when we profoundly engage, it is intimate, it is transformative, and it's emergent. We don't know what's going to happen. Think about, for those of you who are in deep relationships, whether it's marriage or a partner for several years, that dance, there's something else that happens that is different than the two people in the relationship brings to it. There's something else that happens. A relationship emerges if you have vulnerability. And I think a lot of times the way we think about diversity is just that, is not that. We think of inviting someone to our thing rather than engaging with someone and bringing our thing to that engagement. So one, I would say there has to be the intentionality. But 2 is the real openness to see what happens. And I'm not saying that's not present, but I think that oftentimes when I talk to groups about diversity, whether it's bringing more X into Y, it's structured in a way that's already problematic. It's structured in a way that already says to someone, you're a guest in somebody else's house, or you're a guest in someone else's conversation.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you refer to as othering.
Yes.
In your book.
Yes.
Yeah. What would contemplative practice, or what would the contemplative practice movement look like when infused with social justice wisdom?
Great question. You know, I don't know in the future, but in the past, I would say it looks like Gandhi. It looks like Dr. King. It looks like Mother Teresa. It looks like Thich Nhat Hanh. It looks like, people who, to use a word that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, people who are bodhisattvas, people who are engaged with the world. There's a young man, a young African-American man. He was walking down the street with a friend, getting ready to go to have lunch. And this homeless guy comes up to him, true story, and says, "Do you have any money?" And he said, "I don't have any money, I just have a credit card." The guy says, "I need, $2 to get some money for food." He says, "I don't have any money, but I have a credit card." He said, "But if you want food, why don't you join us for lunch?" And the homeless guy says, "Well, thank you, but I was going to get food for me and my wife, who's around the corner." And this young black kid said, "Go get your wife." And they all went to a restaurant and had food. To me, this is, it's so beautiful, right? It's like, it was including, it was engaging the world in a loving way. So I think there are many different expressions of it. There's not one expression, but it's, it's like, think about something in a museum. I was talking to someone recently who said they felt like they were in a museum, and they did that they were a vase in a museum, and they were not being used. They needed to get back in the world and be used. And I think that sometimes our practice can be like being in a museum, instead of getting out in the world and being used. And so to go back and forth and back and forth, you may have to retreat sometime, literally, but a retreat, from my perspective, so you can hold and live in the world in a bigger way. So I don't think there's one expression of it, but I think there's an intention of it.
That's a beautiful metaphor. Thank you. And this follows on that. What would be a daily example of a practice that would lead to social justice?
The thing that's interesting, I don't know how many you know, there's a friend of mine, his name is David Loy. He wrote a book called A Buddhist History of the West. And he writes that that maybe we've learned some things in the last 2,500 years, maybe not. But what he's suggesting is that that there's structures, there's systems at play that actually affect who we are, that affect how we live our lives. And so part of the engagement with life in a contemplative way seems to me also require not just, in a sense, watching our sensations in our body, but actually being contemplative about the world. And so when we see patterns in the world, what does that mean? And I love Joanna Macy's work, who talks about looking at suffering in the world, and she writes about systems. So I think it's sort of unfolding, but I think, and again, I love her work, and she wrote a book called World as Lover, World as Self. And in that book, she writes about, there's a period where she's actually struggling with depression because, and the doctor basically tells her to get over it, and he gives her, some suggestions for prescription to feel better. And then at some point she realized, wait a minute, I don't necessarily want to feel better. The world is suffering, and I'm experiencing that suffering. I'm literally suffering with the world. I am compassionate with the world. Again, you can be done in a debilitating way. But I think to actually engage, and you can tell I've used that word many times. I have children, and I used to say, if I were to wish my children one thing, it would not be happiness, it would not be quiet, it would be engagement. And I think a contemplative practice can help us engage, or we can use it to disengage. And I think in that engagement, to me, that's my practice. It's like, and sometimes it's hard. It's like, it's hard to sit with things. It's hard to be with things. It's hard to see things. Quick story, and then I was assaulted about 4 years ago. Had several broken ribs. There were gunshots. I was kicked by several guys, laid on the ground, and then I still have some soreness in my body from that. And I'm a pretty open person. So a couple of years later, I'm in a restaurant, vegetarian restaurant in San Francisco, and this young woman comes in, and she's white. She has a dog. She's obviously traveling. She asked me, "Do you know if there's any place where I can, a youth hostel or something, I can sleep tonight?" And my first response was, I don't know, but if you check your phone, you can find something. And then as soon as I said that, I was like, how stupid. Obviously he doesn't have a cell phone, right? Again, this was from my perspective. And she said, oh, that's okay, I'll be fine. What I would have done before that incident is that I would have either invited her to my house or I would have given her money. But there was a deep anxiety. There was still that fear that wasn't really directed at her personally, but was permeating my relationship. Everyone now is a potential threat. Mm-hmm. And so it closed me off. And I drove around for an hour trying to find her. I felt so bad because I felt like I could, my interaction with her highlighted my constriction, my tension, my anxiety, which I don't like being in the world that way. So part of the social practice, I think, engaging in the world, it's just when we experience that in ourselves, when we have those experiences, when we, where do we live? How do we respond to people? How do we respond to homeless people? How do we respond to those structures? I think there are all these learning moments, all these opportunities to deepen the practice in the world as we engage. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, living the experience from a place of awareness is really where it all begins.
That's
Being
right.
to walk around not aware of your own history, your own biases, your own experiences, and how they frame the way you relate to life and others really that's probably the most seminal part of the practice, is just that level of awareness, as many people in this room are very aware. I think I have time for a couple more questions. And by the way, I wish I could get to all of them. All the questions I'm reading that are being handed to me are absolutely fabulous, so thank you. I'm going to go for this one. In the United States, the race conversation is often black and white. How do we keep the dialogue more expanded and inclusive for all?
Again, it's a very, very good question. So what I focus on a lot is what I call othering and belonging. Othering and belonging. And in terms of studying this and thinking about it, each society at any given time has a dominant way of othering in which they organize the other. Who is the designated other? And in terms of that, it also defines those who belong. Mm-hmm. So it's a dialectic. There really is no other, but we have this practice of othering. And then it not only informs the target, it informs the actor. And so this is how I think about race in the United States. But it's not race. Race is an expression of this larger project of othering and belonging. And it happens along many different axes. It happens along the axis of gender. It happens along the axis of disability. It happens along the axis of age. And when we don't have a sense of not belonging, it's like the students at UT Austin. We then don't perform. It creates stress. When the other shows up in a place where he or she doesn't belong, it creates tension in the environment. So that's how I talk about, that's how I expand the conversation about race. But having said that, I would say that race has been powerfully important in terms of, including black and white, in terms of structuring the ethos, the institution, the culture, the systems within the United States. In that sense, race, and particularly black and white, as it's played out, is actually this large infrastructure that whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian, it's not accidental that when I live in San Francisco, that when people push for marriage equality, they call it the new civil rights movement. They actually sometimes will say gay is the new black, because in a sense, and some people find that offensive, but in a sense they're saying there's a prototype for a struggle to belong in the United States, and it comes largely from the civil rights movement. So I would say we need to enlarge the discussion, as the question suggests, but we also need to deepen the discussion. We need to better understand the role of race, and particularly black and white race in the United States, in constituting not just segregation or ghettos, but constituting the United States. I was teaching a class, and I was teaching about a case called the Teton case, which is about Native Americans. And basically, the United States appropriating land from Native Americans. Appropriating, another word for stealing. But some of the white students objected, and they said, why are we studying Native American history? This is not a Native American class. And I said, you're not studying Native American, you're studying US history. You're studying the United States. And you can't understand the United States without understanding its relationship to the land that it took from another people. In the same way, I would say, you can't understand the United States. And by the United States, I mean the people in this room, without understanding the role of race. It is so incredibly fundamental. And it's not, again, doesn't mean you're studying black people or Latinos. It means you're studying this country. So yes, I think there's a need to actually broaden the discussion, and I do that by talking about belonging and othering. But there's also a need to go deeper in terms of the role of race, slavery, appropriation of land, Native Americans, not so you understand Native American culture, so you understand your own culture. So that's how I would approach it.
And just a quick follow-up to that, how can contemplative practice help to facilitate or enhance that understanding of your role, of our collective role? Do you see a place for that?
I was teaching a class in Minnesota, and I had this exercise, and I talk about it in my book. So I asked the students, I said, how many of you have had the experience of being some inanimate object, some other species? And virtually all the students raised their hand. And then we went around the room and they shared some of their experiences. And one student was, I was an eagle and I was flying above, looking down. Another one, I was a stream. I was flowing, hitting rocks. And I said, great. And we went on. So then I said, all right, these were mainly white students at University of Minnesota. And I said, so how many of you have had the experience or the of being, or imagine yourself as a black woman? No hand went up. I said, that's curious. I said, you've never imagined, dreamed yourself as a black woman? And the students objected. They said, well, I'm not a black woman. And I said, that's fair, but neither are you an eagle. And it was interesting to me that even in their imagination, even in their dreaming, there was a structure to it that was racialized. And so I challenged them, this was early on in the semester, to actually practice, open up, soften up, to take on the sensibilities of different races. And by the end of the class, end of the year, virtually all the students had. And there was one student who came to me years later, 5 years later. He called me up, he said he wanted to take me to lunch. And it's always nice to go to lunch with your students, that's when they're paying. And he said, Professor Powell, that was a wonderful exercise you had us do. And I just want you to know that I recently had this experience of, I had a sense of what it would be like to be a black gay man. And he said, and I wasn't black, and he said, but I want to tell you, I'm not gay. I want to make that clear. So from my perspective, I believe if we really soften into this space with deep awareness, we actually, I'm not saying we can become each other, but in our multiplicity, our identities will shift. And shift in some pretty powerful ways. We talk about race being socially constructed, and I think it is. But so is the self socially constructed. And again, if we soften these strictures and stories, I think our ability to actually, and I think we can do this in a contemplative practice. We can, have some leaning into what it's like to be an ego, and what it's like to be disabled, and what it's like to be old. And so when you read some of the icons of Buddhism and contemplative practice, they talk about having been different things, and sometimes talk about in terms of reincarnation. But to me, it's not reincarnation. It's basically softening into something so that you can actually take on, realize not only we are connected to each other, that in fact we are each other.
That sounds like a beautiful place to end this dialogue. Thank you for the blessing of your wisdom. Let's please thank John.
Thank you.